All right, guys, we're live. All right, cool. Welcome to Graphic Novel Geek. We're joined with by David Lucarelli. We're talking about his comic book.
Hello.
Keith, you want to take it away, Keith?
Yeah, sure. Thanks everyone for joining us on Graphic Novel Geeks. David Lucarelli is creator of Tinsel Town, a great indie comic by Alterna Comics, and we're excited to have him here. It's a great comic that I've really been enjoying the last couple years, and so glad to have you here, David. Why don't you tell our viewers a quick intro of who you are and how you got into comics and comic creating?
Yeah, so I've been a fan of comics my whole life. I mean, I grew up with them. In terms of inspiration influences, I'm a big Jack Kirby guy. I love Dave Stevens is one of my favorite artists. And in terms of writers, Frank Miller, pre 9/11, Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman, all those guys really were big influences on me. And I found myself, I'm also a musician. And at a certain point, I found myself married with a young boy. And suddenly the dream of going on the road with my band didn't seem that appealing. But, I didn't want to die not having made some comics. And I find that's a great meter for choosing one's creative direction. If you say to yourself, well, if you died tomorrow, what would you regret not having done?
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, leave a legacy for yourself, something for people to know who you are, what you were thinking, why you mattered.
Sure.
Cool. And so you're down in Southern California, near Hollywood?
Yeah, actually in Hollywood. Yeah, in Hollywood proper. It's great because there's Hollywood the business and there's Hollywood the neighborhood. And Hollywood the neighborhood is actually a very cool place to live. It's a lot more family friendly than you might think, and we're just close enough to all the craziness that we can walk to it and we can see great live theater and live music and go to great restaurants, but we're just far enough away from it that the craziness doesn't follow us back home.
Wild, wild. I've lived near downtown San Francisco, and the craziness is all around when you're down there.
Yeah. My experience of you said downtown San Francisco?
Yeah.
Yeah. I That's actually where I met my wife. She was living up in San Francisco at the time, so I know a
Oh,
little bit about that.
oh, cool. Great, great. Were you just on vacation when you guys came and met, or?
We actually, it's funny. We hooked up through MySpace back when that was a thing,
Oh,
and then
okay.
I flew up to San Francisco to meet her.
Okay. Wow. Cool. Well, great. Well, Hollywood is the setting for your Tinsel Town series.
Yeah.
Although there's back in time to 1915. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your Tinseltown series?
Yeah, so Tinseltown is a period crime drama about one of the first female police officers in Hollywood. So it's been compared to LA Confidential meets Boardwalk Empire. Um, it was in part a tribute to my mother, who was a police officer. She proudly served as a Pittsburgh police officer for 20 years. And it was also inspired by some historical circumstances. Universal Studios in 1915, in some ways, was kind of a proto feminist organization. They had a female mayor, female police chief, female police officers, and they kind of functioned as a cross between lot security guards and people there to amuse and assist the tourists. But they also were not above marching them in short skirts and parades and things like that. So it was an interesting dichotomy. Tinseltown, the first graphic novel, has already been collected by Alterna, as you see right there, and then the second miniseries, Tinseltown: Losing the Light, we're running the Kickstarter for right now, and both of those are going to be director's cuts. So you get 5 additional pages of story that's not in the miniseries, and you get a bunch of unreleased pinups. And Losing the Light's going to have an introduction by Tony Isabella, the creator of Black Lightning, too.
Right, cool. Yeah, I know that a lot of the things you just mentioned seem to take place in your comic. The marching them around in short skirts. There's a lot of back and forth about with Abigail and her bosses and talking to her friends about the treatment and her just wanting to be taken seriously and to be able to do her job. But back to like the short skirts bit, I mean, how much it sounds like this was pretty well researched and in some ways pretty, accurate historically. How is that true? And how did you do your research?
Yeah, so I've done a ton of research, especially for Losing the Light, actually. Everything from doing the Hollywood walking tours where you find out, okay, here's the office that Raymond Chandler had at Sunset and Vine, where he wrote his noir fiction from while looking out onto the street, to reading a whole bunch of books without giving too much away about Losing the Light. It starts to the geopolitical situation at the time of the First World War is a factor. And so I started researching the history of early espionage and also how the mob worked and how that was intertwined in the early days of Hollywood. So there's a great book out there for anybody that's interested called Dark Invasion that talks about how on the East Coast, there were actually a lot of incidents of terrorism where there were bombs being placed on ships that were sending supplies to Europe for the war, and the U.S. government pretty much covered it up because they were trying to delay their entry into the war for as long as possible.
Oh, cool. Sounds like an interesting book there, especially for history buffs. Great. So let's talk a bit more about Tinsel Town. Again, this series has it stars a female character, Abigail Moore, and she got into being a security officer, police officer for a Hollywood lot. Why don't you introduce Abigail Moore and how did she become a lady cop?
Yeah, so she is the daughter of a fallen police officer, and she initially tries to become a police officer for the LAPD. And they did have some female police officers at the time historically, because even back then there were female teenage runaways, prostitutes, drug addicts, and the male police officers didn't feel comfortable doing strip searches with them, obviously. So that's kind of how the very first female police officers started to be hired around that period. But they didn't have very many of them. So she doesn't get a job working for the LAPD right out of the gate. She responds to an ad in the paper where they are holding auditions for police officers at Utopia Studios. And so there's a bit of irony there, because the guy that ends up being her boyfriend, Tennessee Dan, he comes into town looking to be a stuntman in the movies, So by the end of the first Tinsel Town, he is a real cowboy who is now playing a fake one in the movies, and Abigail is kind of a fake cop who is on her way to becoming a real one.
Yeah, I feel like what really drives this series is there's some great action scenes throughout, but the character interactions are really the driving force. I feel like you've got some really good character development, and just kind of the in-between moments are very exciting to me, very interesting, I guess. But of course, it's still splashed with interesting action moments as well. As you said, it's a crime drama, crime detective story.
Yeah, that scene that you just showed, by the way, that was inspired by some real life stuff too. Universal had a zoo on the lot, and the camels kept escaping. They kept jumping the fence, so they would get calls in the middle of the night that Bertha was on the loose.
Animal.
Cool. Okay. So yeah, you've got the artwork in here is really great. I enjoy it a lot. Who's your artist, and can you tell us a little bit about how you ended up with your artist?
Yeah, so that's Henry Ponciano. He's a Filipino artist, and we've been working together for about 10 years now. The very first comic I did, Children's Vampire Hunting Brigade, I started off with a different artist, and he managed to fall off the face of the earth. So, so then I got Henry, and I found him in the Deviant Art Classifieds. And for those who don't know, Children's Vampire Hunting Brigade is kind of a coming of age gothic adventure, sort of a punk rock Buffy set in Scotland. And there are 3 novels in the series, all 3 of which, by the way, are available in the Tinsel Town Losing the Light Kickstarter. And the reason why it's set in Scotland, it was inspired by the Gorbals vampire incident. So in real life, in Scotland, hundreds of school kids in the 50s went looking for a vampire in this one cemetery over several nights. It was considered mass hysteria. But in our book, they find what they're looking for, they form the brigade, and then 50 years later, there's a couple juvenile delinquents drinking in that graveyard the night the vampires come back. So Henry's art style for that book was black and white with gray tones. This sort of befits the horror genre. And then Tinsel Town obviously is full color, but yeah, he's great. And he was great 10 years ago, and he just keeps getting better and better with every panel he does. So
Yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. All right. Well, you had mentioned that Abigail Moore was inspired by your mother, and well, what do you know? It happens to be Mother's Day.
that's right.
Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there, mine in particular. And we literally would not be here without you, mothers.
Very true.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your mother, some of her real life adventures, in particular the ones that you drew from to create Abigail Moore?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that Abigail Moore is my mother. I mean, that would be a little too simple. She's really kind of an amalgamation of lots of strong women that I've known throughout my whole life. But definitely a large part of it obviously was inspired by her. And my parents got separated and ultimately divorced when I was very young. My mother was in her mid to late 30s, and she needed to have a new career in which she could, keep raising me to the lifestyle which I had become accustomed. And she grew up loving Nancy Drew books and that kind of thing, and so she applied to be a police officer. And she told me a really interesting story where at one point they took her up and the other recruits up to the top level of a building, and they said to them, look down on the street, you see all those people there. If you were in a life and death situation where one of those people had a gun and they were shooting innocent civilians and you had to shoot that person to kill, could you do it? And my mother thought to herself and she said, yeah, I could do it. And that was one of the things that they asked them about. But my mother, even before she was a cop, she was a member of the Army Reserves, so she was kind of built for that. She liked not having to choose what she needed to wear for work every day. And, she had a lot of adventures along the way. She had a meat cleaver thrown at her once. It missed. Wow. Thank God. She and her partner captured and apprehended a murderer. She was supposed to get an award for that, but her captain conveniently forgot to tell her and her partner about that and simply accepted it on their behalf.
Okay.
And growing up, she told me, most police officers are good people trying to do a very difficult job, and they are imperfect and human, and unfortunately they make mistakes, and when they do that, sometimes people can get hurt and sometimes people can get killed. But she also said that there are police officers that are just as bad or worse than any of the criminals that they arrest, and that unfortunately the system is very much set up to protect those individuals. So, that all that kind of finds its way into some of the themes of the comic as well.
Yeah, interesting. And I think, we still see some of those same problems today, that are now starting to be talked about in various different ways, but, still problems that persist probably since the police departments have been set up.
Well, I think it's an age-old question, right? Who watches the Watchmen?
Yeah, good
Yeah.
point. All right. Well, cool. Hey, Joe, I believe that you had a few questions. You want to shoot those off to David?
Yeah. So, when you approach actually like writing, your stories, whether it's Tinsel Town or the Children's Vampire Brigade, I'm just curious, like, script wise, in terms of formatting, like, are you kind of like, or I guess like, what kind of software are you using?
Yeah, I
Are
just
you, yeah, Matt's laughing at me. We were talking yesterday, but I'm a writer myself.
Mhm.
Actually, like, so I first came across David actually back in 2014 at one of the last alternative press expos in San Francisco, and that was before I had books, before I had, made anything. And I think that's when I was talking to like, indie creators and just trying to get advice and just trying to support everyone. So this just a little backstory, but like now, many years later, obviously he's still at it. I'm still trying to continue, but I'm just very intrigued about your creative style, formatting, scripting and all of that, since obviously, I've been doing it myself for a while, but I just always want to see how other creators just kind of, try to bring sense to the madness in their heads.
Yeah, so generally speaking, the way I do is I write the script with the panel by panel breakdown in Final Draft, and I send that off to Henry, always with the caveat that if he has a better way to break stuff up or down, or in terms of the visual descriptions of the panels, he's the artist, so he's obviously more visually inclined than me. But and then he sends me back rough panels, and at that point, if I have any notes about revisions, he revises them, and then he gives me the final panels. And at that point, if I have any note about revisions, then he charges me a little more, which is fine. And but usually that doesn't happen at that point, because we've been working together for so long now. We're generally speaking, we're on the same page to the point of almost being able to read each other's minds.
Yes.
And but that is, for me, that's the most exciting part about making comics, is when you turn that script in and then you get the pages back and you see your vision realized through the creative lens of the artist and everything that they contribute to it too. I'm a big believer in the 210 rule. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but basically it dates back from the Mort Weisinger period of DC. When Neil Gaiman was trying to figure out how to write comics, he asked Alan Moore, and that was one of the bits of advice that Alan Moore gave him, which is essentially, you never want to have more than 210 words per page and then subdivided by panels. So if you have, about 6 panels, it works out to be about 35 words per page. And what that gives you is a nice healthy balance between words and picture, and it's appropriate for today's modern sort of semi-decompressed comic book storytelling. You can find lots of examples that violate that if you go back to, say, the EC comics of the 50s, where the word balloons are so heavy there's barely enough room for the art. Not to say that those comics aren't great, because a lot of them are, but I figure if it's a good enough rule for Alan Moore to sit there and count every word in the word balloons, then it's probably worth paying attention to.
No, very cool. Yeah, just similar workflow with me and my artists. I'm curious, was there ever, I'm sure there was, like a moment in particular where you got like a page back and just said, this isn't, again, exactly what I was going for, but like the artist actually brought something way cooler to it that you actually kind of just paused and said, ooh, I like that. And then actually used that change and actually incorporated that into like your story, like made some tweaks here and there to actually account for this new change that the artist brought in because they brought something really cool to the table.
Yeah, there's a couple examples of that. At first I was a little worried because I was thinking, okay, well, Henry's Filipino. Is there going to be a language communication barrier, stuff like that? And my wife, who used to be a airline flight attendant that went to the Philippines, she said the Philippines are the most Americanized Asian country in the world, like more so than Japan, more so than any of it. She's like, don't worry about it. And I said, okay. And she was right. So there are a couple of things that spring to mind. There was one where I forgot to include in the description. I wanted to have these vampire bats that essentially had human-looking heads, because I had gone to Glasgow. I had gone to the actual cemetery where the incident took place a couple of times as a guest of Glasgow Comic-Con when I was working on volumes 2 and 3. And I had seen they have these giant statues at this building nearby that are kind of like that, and they're really genuinely creepy. But I had forgotten to include that in the description, and then I got the art back from Henry, and it was just that, and I was like, wow, that is... He goes, I thought it would be cool if they had human-like heads, and I go, yeah, that is cool. That's actually exactly what I wanted. I just forgot to tell you. There was another time too where there were a couple older members of the brigade that had to dispose of a vampire, and Henry came up with this idea that if they had silver razor wire that they strung up along this entrance, that if the vampire came through it, it would literally slice them into pieces as they were coming through the entrance. And so that was completely his idea, and it looks really cool too, the way that he drew it, for sure.
Nice.
So if the vampire is sliced by silver razor wire, does that essentially deanimate / kill them, or are they still, does it have to get through the heart, or could they like come back together still? What's the effectiveness of that?
We didn't get that granular about it, but
Okay.
I think it cuts them into enough micro pieces that probably the heart is taken care of in the process.
Okay. Interesting. Gotta, fact check these things.
Yes.
Vampires are real, right? Yeah.
Vampire logic here. Come on now.
That's right. Well, it's like that great scene in Battlestar Galactica where the ship just like drops itself into the atmosphere to save the humans that have been enslaved by the Cylons and whatnot, and their physics expert told them, like, if you ever drop the ship that fast into the atmosphere, the G-forces alone on it would simply like break it up into bits. And they said, but on the other hand, it's a really cool idea, so let's just do it.
But it looks really cool.
Yeah.
It definitely got away in the cool factor. All right. Cool. Well, so we wanted you here in large part to talk about your newest Kickstarter, which is the director's cut of Tinsel Town, which is the second volume or second series of your Tinsel Town epic. Could you, give us a rundown on what Tinsel Town Losing the Light's all about, and give us your little elevator pitch on why our viewers want to back your Kickstarter.
Sure. So Losing the Light takes place following the first graphic novel. There's a short Tinsel Town comic story called Pin Boy that came out it came out on a Wednesday, number 11. So that's included in there too. That's kind of the prologue to the story, and that introduces an important new character into the series. And in 1916, things are there's Billy, who's working as a pin boy, which back then they didn't have automated lanes, so they would literally have boys working in the lanes to manually reset up the pins in between frames. And one of the problems with that is if the bowlers weren't paying attention, or the boys weren't paying attention, you could very easily get your fingers broken by the ball hitting your fingers as you're trying to change the pins. So so Abigail makes a new friend in Pin Boy, and Billy eventually comes to work on the lot because Abigail tries to stand up for him working as a pin boy, and she inadvertently gets him fired from that job. So she kind of makes it up to him by getting him some work at Utopia. And Utopia Studios is going through a difficult time in Losing the Light because there are a series of accidents that are happening on the lot, and she's trying to get to the bottom of those. There is a scandal with one of Utopia's biggest stars that results in protests and her films being banned, and Utopia's weeks away from not being able to make their payroll when along comes a German director who says, I've got a plan. I'm going to do a big epic costume drama, and this picture is going to save the studio. And the head of Utopia says, well, I'm a little bit worried about filming on the lot because we've had these accidents. He said, don't worry, I've got it all taken care of. We're going to film it down in Mexico. And Mexico at this time is kind of a volatile place because you've got Pancho Villa and all that stuff happening. But basically, Abigail's boss, Miss Redwood, says, why don't you go down and chaperone the production? Just to make sure everything goes well and everything's on the up and up. She goes, whenever anybody tells me, oh, I've got something that's going to save the studio and it's barely going to cost you any money, it sounds a little too good to be true. I just want to make sure that this is what he says it is. And she goes down there and all hell breaks loose. It is not at all what he says it is. And Abigail emerges by the end of the book a changed person based on what happens to her.
All right, great.
That actually sounds really exciting.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
it does, yeah.
Yeah, very, very much a real nail biter, I've got to say. So when I first discovered this series on Etsy, only the first 3 issues of Losing the Light were out. And so I picked up all 3, became a fan, and then I went and got the collection of the first series and was kind of waiting. Because of shipping costs, I didn't want to order just number 4. So
Sure.
I was waiting for issue 5 to come out as well, and then got 4 and 5 at the same time. So I was waiting quite a while. And I was like, oh man, because it's a real nail biter for sure, full of excitement and intense moments. And I really liked that it came out on a Wednesday Pinboy story. It was kind of, it was off from the regular story, and it was just a real intimate moment to get to know this character. And then when I saw the Pinboy, what was his name again?
Oh, Billy.
Yeah. And so then when I saw Billy in Losing the Light, I was really able to appreciate him more. He seemed like a real person there, just because of a simple 8-page story. So that was pretty amazing. I thought, like, just how much I cared about him from just a couple of pages of his own story.
Yeah, so
Um,
Billy's an interesting character because obviously there was a lot of racism at the time, but also Hollywood, in a weird sort of way, in the very early days, was very open to working with people of different races and women for a short period of time. What,
Mm,
it was an industry that was growing so fast at the beginning, that studio lots were literally springing up overnight like these ad hoc shanty towns. And they needed all hands on deck, and women directors, women stars, black people, were everybody was being employed. People that couldn't get employed anywhere else were being employed, and so that didn't last especially long, but it was an interesting fertile period. And actually, in doing research for Tinsel Town Losing the Light, I found out Universal was not the only studio that had female police officers. D.W. Griffith's studio, who made the amazingly racist Birth of a Nation, but they also had female police officers, largely because you had so many thousands of extras coming and leaving the lot on any given day that a lot of these people were hard to keep track of, and they might end up going down a office corridor and getting up to some hanky panky. And so you needed somebody that was like a school marm to keep an eye on them all and make sure that they weren't doing that.
hmm.
all right. Wow. Up to hanky panky.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess that persists in Hollywood.
Yeah, right.
So, okay. So, I just mentioned that I kind of got into your series with Losing the Light, and then read volume 1 after I'd kind of started Losing the Light. If people go to your Kickstarter, are they going to be able to understand Losing the Light without having read volume 1, or do they need to start off with volume 1? What's your recommendation there?
My recommendation would be to get both Volume 1 and Volume 2 and start with Volume 1. Losing the Light is a self-contained story, so you don't have to necessarily have read the first volume to understand what's going on, but at the same time, it does happen sequentially after the first one. The first one is more of an origin story about how she comes to work for Utopia Studios, and then the second one, kind of expands her adventures a bit. So either way, you can start with 2 as you did. Obviously, that didn't ruin the experience for you, but
Nope.
both volumes are available through the Kickstarter.
All right, cool.
Nice.
And what's the easiest way to find the Kickstarter? Well, if you go to our YouTube page, once we've got this video posted, we'll have a link down there taking people directly to the Kickstarter. But otherwise, if they do a Google search or whatever, what's the best way to get there?
Yeah, I think if you just go to Kickstarter.com and you do a search for Tinseltown Losing the Light, Losing the Light kind of has a double meaning. Back then when they were filming, the film stock was very, very sensitive, and so they needed a lot of sunlight to get proper exposure. So as soon as the sun started to go down, they'd say, "Oh, we got to stop filming. We're losing the light." And then there's also, Abigail is exposed to some pretty dark stuff in her adventure in Mexico, and there's that factor of how much darkness and pain can you endure before it starts to affect who you are as a person.
Cool. Yeah, that's pretty deep. I missed that double meaning there. Awesome. Okay, well, cool. So we know that, well, I know that besides Tinseltown and comics, that you have a few other things that you work on. You mentioned music, but I understand you also do some plays, some performances.
Yes, I've written and produced a couple different plays over the years. The first one we did was Dr. Zamba's Ghost Show of Terror, which was a revival of a type of show they used to do in the 1950s called a spook show. So before there were TV horror hosts, before there were haunted houses, there was this thing that was kind of the last vestige of vaudeville and also kind of cutting edge interactive entertainment. They would four-wall a movie theater, and they would usually show a couple scary movies, and then a guy would come out and he would do spooky magic and a seance and maybe some hypnotism, and there might be a burlesque dancer. And then at the very end, the climax, they would have what they call blackout sequence, where all the lights in the theater would go out, and then they would envelop the audience in supernatural phenomena that they could feel, hear, and see. And they had all kinds of tricks for making this happen. There's spook show manuals out there on the web. We studied those. We figured out what they did, put a few twists on it. And so we brought that show back as part of the Hollywood Fringe Fest. And we did 3 runs of it, 2 at that theater, and then 1 at Midsummer Scream. And that was a lot of fun. So I wrote and produced that, and then more recently I did a show called Crude, which is a look at a fictional Hollywood rock band that rises to the top in the 1980s, not in any way legally affiliated with Motley Crue. And we did 2 sold out runs of that, and we filmed it. So there is a online pay-per-view version of it that is available as part of the Kickstarter as well.
Nice.
All right. Cool. Cool. And is there one hub for all of your projects that viewers can go to give us updates on what you're doing, what's coming out?
Yeah, it's abacabstudios.com is the best place to find everything I'm working on. And then, just online in general, David B. Lucarelli on Facebook, at David Lucarelli on Twitter. And I have an Instagram, but I don't use it that much. So.
Okay, great. A lot of the creators that we've had on our show, I think perhaps all of them have all been self-publishing, where you are published by Alterna Comics, a slightly larger comic company that puts out over a dozen titles. How did you get involved with them, and how do you like that as opposed to just being out on your own and doing it yourself? I don't know. It sounds like your Vampire Brigade was maybe self-published. Is that correct?
Yes and no. So I originally self-published the first 4 issues of the Brigade, and then I was approached by a company called Creator's Edge, and they sort of said, "Hey, we like this. We want to put it out as a graphic novel." And so they did that, and they had kind of a business model that was, you sell all of our books at the conventions you do, and then we have other creators, all throughout the country, and they'll sell your books at the conventions they do. And so that actually worked out to be kind of a nice thing, because your book ended up being sold at conventions all throughout the country. And but then they stopped publishing other people's stuff at a certain point, so I put out the 3rd volume of the series under Abacab Studios on my own. And then in terms of Alterna and Tinsel Town, I originally submitted Tinsel Town as a graphic novel to Alterna, and they accepted it. They're one of the few companies that does accept submissions, at least when the submission window is open. And then they came back to me and they said, "Hey, we know we said we'd publish this as a graphic novel, but we just started this newsprint line, and we were wondering if we could break it up into 5 issues and do that." And I said, "Sure." And at the time, they were distributed by Diamond, and they actually had some newsstand distribution, which was nice. So that was good. Their business model post-pandemic has somewhat changed. Now what they do is they do kind of a seasonal Indiegogo for all of the issues that are coming out during that season from the company, and you can back that. So that's what they've been doing. They don't actually do graphic novels anymore, just the single issues. So while the first graphic novel came out through Alterna, this one's going to come out through Abacab Studios, but Peter Samedi, the guy that runs Alterna, is designing the book, so it's going to look essentially very similar in format to the way the first one was done.
So that's interesting. That their model was shifted to just doing singles and no graphic novels or trades. When like I guess I would think like collected editions are easier to kind of move, right? Because it's like a complete story as opposed to like singles, like maybe like a Goblet had mentioned, like if you just need issue 4 to complete your set, or if issue 1 and 2 are out of print, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Kind of interesting. So they're really sticking with the single model. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I understand.
Sell all the completed editions, right? Like that won't be like a stocking kind of issue.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if they have issues that go out of print, sometimes they'll reprint the issues.
Okay.
So that's a factor. But again, you as a creator at Alterna, you own the intellectual property, so you have the right to republish anything that they've published in a graphic novel format. So that's not an issue.
Okay. Cool. Okay. Interesting.
Cool. Yeah. And like one thing that attracted me to the Alterna Comics line, I picked up a couple of different titles. Wolf and Batsy, Mr. Crypt and Baron Rat. They've got this great $1.99 price point. So the highest barrier to entry there is the shipping cost. So it's like, okay, you go on in, get like maybe 5 different comics, and then it makes sense to get them shipped to you. And it's really cool to try them on out. But
yeah, they have a really nice, wide variety of different types of books, like books for all ages, children's books. I would say Tinsel Town is more PG-13, but they are. I think they just announced they're raising the price to $225 per book.
All right, they're 90s prices right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and do you? I mean, I'm sure you don't want to badmouth your publisher online, but do you like being a part of Alterna? Are they treating you well, and you find it working out well for you?
Yeah. They do a lot of live streams, and they've got a really supportive community. I think a lot of people ended up picking up Tinsel Town. I know because they've come up to me and said like, hey man, I wasn't really sure that this book was for me, but it came out through Alterna and I buy all the other Alterna titles, so I figured I'd give it a chance, and I ended up really liking it. So there's that, which is one of the great things about being an indie creator. I just did Free Comic Book Day a couple weeks ago, and I had a guy come up to me and he said, I bought your book Tinsel Town last year. I took a chance on it, and up until that point I was just a big Marvel DC guy, and I liked it so much that now I buy a whole bunch of other indie titles, and you kind of opened up a whole world for me there, and I was like, wow, that's really sweet, and thank you so much for telling me that, because that's a good feeling.
Cool. Yeah. I got to be right back. Tetsuo, maybe you got a few questions for David here.
What I got to say that draws me to Abigail is that in the beginning, she's in your first volume, she's largely kind of ignored by that cop that hires her. That she talks to first, like, yeah, you just do it, and she takes it upon herself to actually do and help people and do the right thing, which is actually interesting. It's like not given direction, but taking the initiative to do it on her own. That's actually the cool thing.
Yeah, she earns her boss, Miss Redwood's respect throughout the course of the series, and I think it's interesting. Female police officers, obviously, there are situations where that call for brute force, but so often in police work, having somebody that can come in and simply diffuse a situation and understand the dynamics of what's going on and listen to everybody and let them tell their story and try to solve the problem that way is much healthier than some of these guys that just come in like gangbusters, pouring gasoline on the situation and trying to dominate their way through solving whatever is going on.
Yeah.
So, Abigail she's not always perfect. Sometimes, and in fact, frequently, often, she gets stuff wrong. But at the end of the day, she's a good person, and she is somebody that you want to have in your corner.
Yeah, that's great. No, like talk to people.
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
talk to people. Because actually I was talking with Matt last night, and I brought up because he's a big Flash fan. I brought up there was an episode of I want to say, yeah, it was Justice League that I watched recently where Flash, Batman, and Orion, they go into this bar, like a villain bar, and to go talk to the trickster, voiced by the amazing Mark Hamill.
Oh, yes,
But it's
national
so great.
treasure.
Yeah, but it's great because Orion and Batman initially are like trying to rough him up and like use aggression to get him to talk. And then Flash, like legit perfect example, diffuses that, just says, wait a second. And he goes and sits down with them and goes, James, are you taking your meds? And then he's just like, no, I don't like them. I'll take them, I guess, when I get low. And then he's just like, yeah, but James, you're wearing the costume. It's like, oh, I am? And then, like he says, he convinces them to go back to the hospital, but he's just like, I'll go visit you and we'll play darts, soft darts, right? And he's like, and then like he goes, okay, and then tells him what he wants to know, and then yeah, it's like solved. And then he goes back. Flash goes back over to Batman and Orion. Orion's like, you're just gonna leave your nemesis there, and then he's just like, oh right, James, like when you finish that drink, go back to the hospital, okay? And he's like, you got me again, Flash. But it's just, again, that humanity, again, talking to people, diffusing situations.
Absolutely. My mother used to tell me about some of her experiences, and she said, there's not necessarily two sides to every situation. There might be 102 sides to a situation, and you are coming across people that are at very extreme points in their life, and they may have done something that they never in a million years imagined themselves as being capable of doing. And they may have all kinds of incredibly strong emotions about what has happened to them, and have felt that they didn't have any choice and that they are in an out of control situation. And they just need somebody to listen to them and understand why they may have made these kinds of choices. And she, would also talk about there's old school criminals and new school criminals. And she would much rather deal with an old school criminal who understands that if you routinely break the law, part of the price of doing that is that occasionally you're going to get caught and you're going to get arrested. And that's just what it is. And so you go quietly and you go to jail and you wait your trial. And it's all part of being a, small time petty career criminal, versus the new young bucks who, may be young and angry at the world and have something to prove. And those are the ones that you've got to be really careful of, because they may feel like they've got nothing to lose, and that can be dangerous.
Yeah, that's well said. Yeah. That's true.
Makes sense.
Another thing that I think is interesting with Abigail is that the uniform she gets is literally a costume, like a prop. And, she takes it and it's her uniform as a police officer. It's pretty cool that it's like they gave her a costume. Like, oh, look how serious you are. Here's a costume for you. And then she's like, it's my uniform actually now.
Right, because not everything in Hollywood is quite what it seems. And as a matter of fact, there will be a third Tinsel Town series, and in that one we're gonna get into the whole uniform issue, because the real LAPD, if you look at the uniforms that the women wore at the time, they didn't have money in the budget for uniforms for female officers, so they look like they're made out of like a gray burlap sack. They look incredibly uncomfortable and like itchy.
Wow.
So Abigail's gonna go through all of this trouble eventually, not to give anything away of what's coming, but to try to be a real LAPD police officer, and in some ways she's actually going to find that she's going backwards, and she has a whole lot less freedom than she did simply working as a security guard at Utopia Studios.
Cool.
Yeah, I guess that brings us into, so what do you have planned for the future?
Yeah, eventually there will be a Tinsel Town 3. Tinsel Town, it's going to be called Tinsel Town Lady Killer. And because it's really one of the themes of Tinseltown Losing the Light is that of identity, right? A lot of people came out to Hollywood to reinvent themselves. A lot of the stars changed their names. Well, who else changes their names? Spies change their names. They have multiple identities, and women typically change their name when they get married. So that's kind of those are the three categories, right? In Tinseltown Lady Killer, it's really in some ways going to be an examination of the nature of fame and the bright side of it, the freedom that it can afford you, where you're put up on a pedestal and you're basically free of any of the bounds of morality. Obviously, that can have a dark side to it as well. And fans can turn on you in a heartbeat, and that can be dark. But how else do you get famous? Well, in America, outlaws and killers have always had their fair share of fame too, and never did that entwine more than in the early days of Hollywood, where you had an industry that was just coming up, and the money in a lot of ways was tied up with the mob.
Interesting. Yeah, there was I believe you had mentioned before a little bit of a mob ties, spy ties in I believe specifically in Losing the Light. So you're developing those themes a little bit more in your third series?
Exactly.
Okay, cool. Very interesting action crime drama spy thriller.
Poor Abigail.
Yeah, I know. She's got a lot to deal with.
So, 'cause I'm noticing, like the progression of her arc that you're having. Clearly, in the beginning, she's like, she's clearly obviously going to be a good person who's always going to try to do the right thing. But it's that whole thing of kind of being naive and then kind of being thrust into more darkness.
Yeah. I mean, in Tinseltown Losing the Light, again, not to give anything away, but at one point she is literally tortured.
Yeah, I kind of figured that. Like, without you saying it, when you life-changing situations, I was like, yeah.
Yeah, and that is something that deeply affects her, and we'll see the repercussions of that for really the rest of her life.
Yeah. Okay, very nice.
Interesting. And so the third volume is going to be set in roughly the same time frame too. So it's the first one started 1915. What's the progression time wise there?
Yeah, this one, Losing the Light's 1916, so the third one will probably be 1917, somewhere around there. And I'm going to be working on that. I also want to do a horror anthology. A comics anthology, and I also want to do, I think I'm going to do my first superhero book that is just going to be an all ages thing, probably not more than 3 issues, but inspired by some of the role-playing games my son and I used to play when he was a little toddler, because that a lot of that stuff is near and dear to my heart, and I kind of feel like if I wait any longer, I might lose the spark of what that was all about.
What role-playing games are those?
Well, where we would just play superheroes and make up plot lines on the fly as we were playing, things like that.
Okay.
I remember the first time we were watching TV and I was showing him Ultraman, and he said, I want to do that. And I said, you mean you want to pretend you're Ultraman and I'll be a monster? And he said, yeah. And it kind of went on from there.
Cool.
That's a great inspiration right there for a comic book.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah.
No, it's funny because it's like, I think back to like when I was a kid and like, even just by myself or my cousin, just even stories you would just make up with your action figures.
Sure.
kid playing, but then sometimes you think back to some of that, you're like, some of these storylines actually weren't that bad.
Oh yeah. A lot of them were inspired because you're just
Yeah.
you're trying to have fun, and
Yeah.
so it makes for a fun story.
Yeah. For sure. I've definitely have drawn upon ideas from my childhood and tried developing them a little bit further. Too bad I can't draw a little bit better.
Yeah, I wish I could draw it all, so I feel your pain.
Same.
Great. Well, it's been super great talking to you. We're about ready to wrap up here. Is there anything more you'd like to tell us about yourself or your series?
Just I guess I should mention the Kickstarter campaign. Obviously, you can get volumes 1 and 2 of the series. You can get the single issues. You can get the complete Children's Vampire Hunting Brigade. In addition to that, we've got rewards levels where you can get 3 Tinsel Town pins. You can get Tinsel Town prints by a bunch of different artists, and you can get a drawing by Henry Ponciano of you being arrested by Abigail Moore on the top end. So that's a fun one. And so, you can also see the pay-per-view of my most recent play, Crude, and things like that. So be sure to check all the rewards levels. There's probably one that's right for you.
Cool.
All right. Great. Yeah, we'll definitely be supporting your project. Can't wait for that to come out. I believe that the end of the Kickstarter date is around the end of May.
Yeah, it ends, I think at probably 8 a.m. the night of the 31st. Yeah, something like that.
Okay, great. So we've got the Kickstarter campaign is active now and running for till the end of May. Be sure to go there and support this great project. I highly recommend the series. I found it super interesting. And you might even viewers may want to consider picking this up for maybe somebody that isn't a traditional comic book fan, because it's not a superhero comic. It is character driven. It's starring a strong female lead. So you might want to consider, if you have a wife, a girlfriend that is, maybe doing something else while you're reading comic books, give them a comic book to read. I think that you would enjoy it, and I think a lot of non-comic fans would really enjoy this series because it is a well-written action crime drama. I think has a good appeal to a wide variety of audiences. So hey, thanks everybody for joining us. Our next episode of Graphic Novel Geeks is going to be same bat time, same bat channel on May 28th. We're just going to be talking about some of our favorite recent comics. Nothing really specific on the agenda. So viewers, if you have anything that you would like us to talk about or review, or have any questions, please feel free to hit us up on our social media. We've got our Facebook discussion group, Graphic Novel Geeks, or you can follow us on Instagram, Graphic Novel Geeks. Shoot us an email, geeks@goblinscomics.com. That's GOBLYNS, goblinscomics.com, and shoot us your questions, comments. We would love to hear from you. And that's about all we've got for today. Anything we're missing here, Tatsuo?
We have one viewer, Chris, again. He actually bought your book at ApeCon too. Yeah.
Oh, hi,
We
Chris.
were actually together, I think, when we met you.
Oh, okay. It's funny. I think I remember you guys.
All right, cool. Thanks for joining us. David Lucarelli, it was awesome having you on the show.
Yeah, I had a blast talking to you guys. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah,
thank
viewers,
you.
thanks for joining us. We'll be back on what day again, Keith?
On May 28th in 2 weeks.
May 28th. Okay, come join us for comic book review, and we'll see you guys later.
Sounds good. Take care, guys.
Thanks a lot.
And